Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. Earlier today, it was revealed by UFC Bantamweight champion Aljamain Sterling that he has a torn bicep and he is unable to fight Henry Cejudo at UFC 285. And now there's some speculation that we may see Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley. So this video is going to be my opinion on what I think happens with the Bantamweight division, what I would like to see happen with the Bantamweight division. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about UFC 285 and what kind of card may end up coming together. So first off, you have Aljamain Sterling, the UFC Bantamweight champion. And it was pretty much assumed since he defeated TJ Dillashaw back at UFC 280, Henry Cejudo retired as the Bantamweight champion in 2020. He's been off for 3 years. There's been speculation about Henry Cejudo coming back for the past year or so, but it's never come to fruition. He was out of the USADA pool, but he is back in the USADA pool as of last year at some point in time, late last year. And it was assumed that we were going to get Aljamain Sterling defending his Bantamweight title against Henry Cejudo at UFC 285, which is the first week of March 2023. And now, Aljamain Sterling, I believe he put it out on his YouTube channel. He says he has a torn bicep. He's been dealing with a torn bicep. And going into a fight against Henry Cejudo, who is a very good wrestler, a very good grappler, he does not want to go into that fight with a compromised bicep. So he needs more time to rehab it, whatever he needs to do to get to 100%. And essentially saying, you know, I'm not going to be able to fight Henry Cejudo in March. Sean O'Malley put out on Twitter, he said, look, if Aljamain Sterling isn't fighting Henry Cejudo, I will fight Henry Cejudo. He said, I think he said something to the effect, let me beat Henry up then. Because it was assumed that the winner of Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo in March would then fight Sean O'Malley in the summer or fall of this year. And obviously now, if Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo were to get delayed, then Sean O'Malley then gets pushed back down the line, and maybe he's not fighting till winter, which I'm assuming he doesn't want to sit out for that long. So what it looks like is going to happen is the UFC is still trying to work together on that UFC 285 card, and I think it all hinges on what happens with UFC 285, because I was originally under the assumption that UFC 285, it used to be the UFC made the March card in Las Vegas a massive card. And I was under the assumption that they were going to do Francis Ngannou versus John Jones. And then the co-main event was going to be Henry Cejudo versus Aljamain Sterling. And then they were going to stack the card. And there's already some good fights on the card. Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Jeff Neal's on the card. And so this was going to be an amazing card. UFC 285, early March. Well, now we still don't have anything announced. We're almost to mid-January. It should be announced by now. It's less than 2 months away. And the UFC's kind of been weird. I mean, remember UFC 279 was super weird in terms of adding fights to the card. They had a main event, but the card was like empty. And then 3 weeks before the fight card, they added fights. So I believe they're still negotiating with Francis Ngannou and John Jones, maybe. I think they already come to terms with John Jones. That's not 100% concrete, but that's what I believe. And I think they're still trying to work it out with Francis Ngannou. And I think it all hinges on UFC 285 and what happens with the Bantamweight division. I believe all hinges on what happens between Francis and Jones. Because if they're able to get Francis and Jones as the main event of that UFC 285 card, it doesn't really matter what's underneath of it. You know, everyone wants a stacked card. We hope for a stacked card. They already have some decent fights on the card. But at the end of the day, Francis Ngannou versus John Jones can stand on its own. Okay, it doesn't need another title fight. But if they're unable to make Francis Ngannou versus John Jones, that's where you run into some trouble. And I don't think the UFC necessarily wants to headline a card with Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo. Cejudo retired as a negotiating tactic back in 2020. The UFC said they didn't care. Most of the fans said they didn't care. And that's why he's been out for 3 years. And I think he's finally coming back, probably because he needs money. But the UFC, in a pinch, they'll headline a fight card with a fight that may be super interesting to hardcores, but isn't going to sell a whole lot of pay-per-views, i.e. Amanda Nunes versus Juliana Pena. You know, something along those lines. There's been worse headliners for pay-per-views. I mean, Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz was a terrible headliner, but that sells more. I get it. But there has been bad pay-per-view headliners. You can go back. Rashad Evans, Dan Henderson was a pay-per-view headliner back in like 2012, 2011, somewhere around there. So if they're unable to get Francis Ngannou versus John Jones done, and let's say that doesn't happen on the UFC 285 card, they're going to need a title fight. And there's really going to be nobody available. Right now, I'm looking through the champions. Unless they do an Amanda Nunes fight as the headliner, I don't see anything else available. If they can't get the heavyweight fight, that's not there. Volk's fighting in February against Islam, so neither one of those, the featherweight division nor the lightweight division, is available. Figgy is fighting in 2 weeks in Brazil. So what else are you going to do? You're going to try to make Adesanya versus Pereira 2 for that UFC 285 card? That's probably too soon considering the amount of damage they took back at UFC 281. That's possible, but unlikely. And then you have Leon Edwards left, who was fighting at UFC 286 in London. So there's really no options. And then the light heavyweight title fight, whoever wins there, Jamal Hill versus Glover Teixeira, is happening in 2 weeks. So they're not going to be available in 5 weeks from that date. It's just not going to happen. So it leaves the UFC without a lot of options. I don't think they can headline a pay-per-view. I mean, they will. They've done it before. But are they going to headline that March pay-per-view with Amanda Nunes? I don't think so. Weili Zhang, I don't think so. Valentina Shevchenko, I don't think so. So they're going to have to find something. Now, one other option, if they're unable to make Henry Cejudo versus Aljamain Sterling, could be a Khamzat Chimaev fight. They did, Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal last year for UFC. I think it was 272. They did Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. I know it didn't ultimately come to fruition, but they did that this year. They could headline this card with like a Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. But the problem with that is Colby Covington is in witness protection. I don't think he's going to leave the safe house. I don't think he wants any part of Khamzat Chimaev. So that's not really a great option either. I mean, they could find another opponent for Khamzat, maybe Bilal, something along those lines. But still not the greatest main event. I mean, I would be okay with the Khamzat versus Colby Covington, but I think that's unlikely. I just don't think you're going to lure Colby Covington out of that safe house to fight Khamzat Chimaev. So what I think is a real possibility, Sean O'Malley, whether you agree with the decision or not, because I thought he clearly lost to Petr Yan, he is now ranked the number one contender. On paper, he has a win over Petr Yan, and on paper, he is ranked number one in the bantamweight division. You can only hide him for so long. Obviously, they stopped hiding him when they put him against Petr Yan. So it's not like, I know a lot of people up until this point were kind of like, oh, they're protecting Sean O'Malley. Even, I was saying it too. He's fighting nothing but trash cans. They matched him up against Petr Yan. It's now sink or swim for Sean O'Malley. He is number one contender. And what I believe the UFC may do, if they cannot find a headliner for that UFC 285 card, I think there is a real possibility they could do Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley with one caveat. It has to be for an interim bantamweight title, which I don't necessarily agree with, because Aljamain Sterling said, he's not going to be out. He kind of alluded to he could probably be ready in April or May. So I don't necessarily agree with an interim title being on the line, but there is no way that they are doing Sean O'Malley versus Henry Cejudo without an interim title on the line. They are 100% putting an interim title on the line. Look back to the heavyweight division. Francis Ngannou said, I can fight in September. This was last year. I can fight in September. Or actually, this was 2 years ago, wasn't it? I can't even remember anymore. He said, I can fight in September. And the UFC said, no, we want you to fight in August. Yeah, that was back in 2021. Holy crap, time is flying by. And the UFC said, no, we need you in August. And Francis Ngannou said, I can't fight in August. So what did they do? They did Derek Lewis versus Cyril Gane for an interim heavyweight title. Aljamain Sterling has been injury prone. He had to cancel a fight with Petr Yan back at UFC 267 back in 2021. They end up having Corey Sandhagen step in and fight Petr Yan for an interim bantamweight title, and then they eventually had the fight. I think it was April of this year, finally had the rematch between Yan and Sterling. So I think if they cannot find a headliner, if they can't make Francis Ngannou versus John Jones, if they can't make Henry Cejudo versus Aljamain Sterling, I think they may just very well make Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley at UFC 285 the main event for an interim bantamweight title. Now, if this fight does happen, I'm going to give you an early prediction for this fight. If this fight does happen, I'm 100% confident that Henry Cejudo wins this fight. Sean O'Malley has proved he belongs in the top 10 of the division. He has proved that he is an elite striker. But if Petr Yan is taking you down repeatedly, and also Petr Yan, when he takes you down, he doesn't look for control. He just looks to try to smash you, and you may be able to pop up to your feet because Yan isn't really trying to control you. If Henry Cejudo gets you down, he's going to be able to control you, and I think Henry Cejudo's wrestling is going to be too much for Sean O'Malley. So an early prediction would be Henry Cejudo, probably by stoppage, maybe second or third round stoppage. But do I really want this to happen? Do I really think it's going to happen? I will say there's kind of like a 60% chance it happens because you don't know what's going to happen with Francis Ngannou. You don't know what's going to happen with John Jones. Aljamain Sterling has kind of already said, look, I'm not fighting in March. He kind of left the door open. He said, I really don't think that's realistic. So he kind of seemed like, he might do it. And he even said last year he didn't want to fight in Abu Dhabi at UFC 280. And he ultimately ended up doing it. And he said earlier this year he wanted to take like 6 months off. And now he's saying I'll fight in April. So it's going to be a little bit sooner than he said. So he said things before that hasn't necessarily added up. So I do believe, I will say definitively, if Francis Ngannou versus John Jones does not happen, and they're not able to pull something else out of their hat, Khamzat Chimaev, Colby Covington, or maybe make Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya 2 for that card, I think they will make Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley for the interim title. They'll give Aljamain Sterling that extra time off. He'll be able to return in the summer. The winner of Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley can fight Aljamain Sterling in the summer. They can, unify the titles. And I think it does happen if they can't find that other main event. What would I like to happen? That's not the ideal scenario. If it was up to me, what I would do is, and if you've been watching my videos or any of my streams, I don't care what matchups happen. I need to see Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera 2. That is the fight to make. So what I think you do is if you're going to make an interim title fight, hear me out. You cancel Corey Sandhagen versus Marlon Chito Vera. You book Marlon Chito Vera versus Sean O'Malley 2 for the interim bantamweight title, headlining UFC 285. The backstory would be incredible. Now it's for a title. They're both arguably deserving, even though I don't really think O'Malley's deserving because I thought he lost Petr Yan, but on paper he beat him. Chito Vera's on a good win streak right now. He's coming off a win over Dominic Cruz. Cancel the Corey Sandhagen fight. Let Sean O'Malley Chito Vera 2 fight happen for the interim bantamweight title at UFC 285. Push Aljamain Sterling back to, May, June, July, somewhere along those lines. Have Henry Cejudo step in and fight Corey Sandhagen, and he can kind of be the number one contender fight. Or if Henry Cejudo doesn't want to do that, then he can wait it out, but he's going to have to wait out till the end of the year because the winner of Sean O'Malley versus Chito Vera 2 is going to fight Aljamain Sterling in the summer. Then the winner of that fight can fight Henry Cejudo at the end of the year. But I would like to see Henry Cejudo get in there against somebody, whether it's Corey Sandhagen, which, he's going to need an opponent if they pull Marlon Vera out of that fight. They could book Henry Cejudo versus Merab Dvalishvili. That would be very, very interesting. But at the same time, Merab said, I never want to fight for the belt if Aljamain Sterling's the champion. So what's the point of possibly having Merab knock off a contender? You could also do, and in my ideal world, here's what I would do, honestly. This is what I would want. Chito Vera, Sean O'Malley 2, bantamweight title. Underneath of it, you do Henry Cejudo versus Petr Yan. And then you have the winner of Marlon Chito Vera versus Sean O'Malley. They fight Aljamain Sterling in the summer. And then you have the winner of Petr Yan versus Henry Cejudo fight the winner of that summer fight in the fall or winter. So you could potentially get a scenario, let's say Sean O'Malley beats Marlon Chito Vera and then goes on to defeat Aljamain Sterling. And then you have Petr Yan who then defeats Henry Cejudo. You could potentially get a defending UFC bantamweight champion Sean O'Malley versus Petr Yan in a rematch of an excellent fight, of a controversial decision. What an amazing backstory that would be. But honestly, the bantamweight division is so good. You can pick names out of a hat and have great matchups regardless. But that would be my ideal scenario for UFC 285. Marlon Chito Vera, Sean O'Malley for the interim title. Underneath of it, Henry Cejudo versus Petr Yan. But honestly, I don't think Henry Cejudo is going to want to fight for anything but the bantamweight title. So he'll most likely just sit out. But he'll probably have to wait till the end of the year to see how the division plays out. But I honestly do believe we may see Henry Cejudo versus Sean O'Malley at UFC 285 for the interim bantamweight title. And then the winner of that fight will most likely fight Aljamain Sterling in the summer. So let me know what you guys think about all this. Comment down below. What version of events do you want to happen? Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.